some of the people with this personality have made massive impacts on society. The thinking creating personality is unique among all other personalities. This is the only one that really combines thinking and building. It's something that happens in your head, and it's also something that happens with your hands. And that's very unique to this particular personality. So let's look at some of the things that they can become that when they have this personality. Philosophers is a big one. And basically, if your child has this personality, they're going to have a really hard time making money off of it. This is one of the things that just never gets monetized. Now, I know we're not supposed to look at our personalities and say, how can I make money off of that? But you do probably want to do something with your personality to make money, because you're going to be doing it your whole life. You'd like to do something that you enjoy. This is a tough one. This is really difficult. Having said that, some massive players on the world stage have had this personality. Philosophers definitely have. People who are interested in abstract ideas, that want to talk about the background information of what's going on, not things that are necessarily going to become an engineering project, but just the idea behind it. Let's talk about the philosophy of freedom. Let's talk about the philosophy of religion and natural law and things that don't have something at the end of it that you can necessarily display, but these are the ideas that move and shape society, so they are super important. These guys this is why it's hard to make money off of it, because they tend to express themselves with art and poetry and essays and dance, and you can make money doing that, but it's hard. The creative arts have always been something that are very difficult to make money on. This is not a concern when your kids are little. You just let them develop and become who they are. It's just something that is. It's just something that our world does not generally pay for a lot of dancers and a lot of artists. Some of them make it big and make a lot of money, but it is something that really comes from their souls, and they're going to do it anyway because it's who they are. If they like math and science, they generally like the concepts. They like acceleration, and they like the background ideas of string theory. They don't necessarily want to do computations or lots of problems in math books, but they like the ideas behind them. You know, why is 0 such a fascinating idea? And when did we come up with negative numbers? And what about infinity? Let's talk about infinity. How come there are multiple layers of infinity? All of those kind of ideas are really fascinating to this type of personality that other personalities don't really care about, and so they do propel a lot of learning forward because they're willing to take the time to think about ideas and to really discuss things that don't matter, right? They don't accomplish any massive goal right here in this moment, but they do set the stage for great breakthroughs in the future. So these guys have some natural strengths. They are unique in that they're able to take their thoughts, and they're also able to not just think the thoughts, but create real world problems with those thoughts. Not all the time. You know, I think if they have to choose, a lot of times they'll stay in their head more than they will be creating things, but they can do both, and that's quite unique. They are very observant of people, of situations, of things. They just recognize what's going on a lot of ways. They have a lot of very deep interests, so they're not superficial on very many things. When they become interested in something, they will do a very deep dive into whatever it is that they're interested in. And they have a very long attention span. So these are the kids who sort of play by themselves, and maybe they color for a long time, or they'll be humming and off in their own little world. And a lot of times parents will say, is it normal for them to want to spend so much time on their own? It totally is. This personality is up in their head and creating imaginary worlds that they're playing in, and that's a very healthy thing for this group to do. They do have a very rich fantasy life. They have they can imagine not only stuff that they've read, but they just create it in their own mind, and they can do a lot of things. You're going to find these kids play with action figures a lot, or if they have modeling clay, they'll actually create something that can be, play games with. Instead of just, oh, that's a pretty house or a pretty tree, they will turn it into a character that can take action because they're just super imaginative. Some of the people who have this personality that you know of and we're all super impressed with, Albert Einstein, Picasso, Stephen Hawking, Emily Dickinson, Henry David Thoreau. These are all people who spend tons of time thinking. You know, the thought experiments that really originated with Albert Einstein. He's the one who first started to say, I can figure this out just by sitting here and thinking deep thoughts. I can just run a scenario in my brain, drop a guy in an elevator in space, and then drop him here in an elevator on the Earth, and can he tell the difference of falling? And then, well, what implications does that have for gravity? All of this is taking place in his head, and he's not running any experiments. Now, eventually he does run experiments. He takes it and creates a lot of real things, but he's not like Thomas Edison, who his main goal was to create a product that could then be sold and make a lot of money. He was almost more of a businessman than anything else, whereas Albert Einstein, he's very much a scientist. He's very much a philosopher. He's thinking about it in his head, and he wants to create it as the culmination of his thought. But Edison was kind of like, I'm going to put this thought in so that I can have the light bulb at the end. So their goals are very different. And you can see both of them obviously made huge changes in the world today. But it is fascinating to see the different approaches that they took to that process. And all these other people are also very fascinating and have brought so much to our world today. They have challenges that come with the territory of having their personalities. They don't like working in groups because they're very independent. They're very, you know, you remember being a kid and you say, imagine this happened and then imagine that happened. It's just not very fun because the other person cannot imagine what you're imagining, and it can be very challenging to connect with other people who cannot see what's going on in your head. Somebody who was really good at this, he was very, very creative, was Nikola Tesla. He had a ton of stuff going on in his head, and he was terrible with groups. He was just really kind of a terrible person when it came to interacting with other people and so was Albert Einstein. They didn't have any social skills because they were all up in their heads and they were all creative, and other people couldn't see what was happening inside their head, so they got left behind, and it was like you didn't hear the first part of the conversation, so stop butting in is the basic idea, that these guys feel like I'm already working on a problem and you weren't a part of that, and so they kind of can be a little bit antisocial. And they can get really distracted. They're very busy up in their heads, so they'll miss appointments and they're late to things, and that can be a challenge. They can also be moody or inconsiderate, and both Tesla and Einstein were incredibly moody and incredibly inconsiderate. Now, I know a lot of kids who have this personality who are not moody or inconsiderate. You're not doomed. You don't have to be what these guys are. It's just, it's a natural problem that comes with this personality. You just have to be aware of and say, hey, now let's get out and work with other people and remember that you are a social being and not just what's going on in your head. And they do have a tendency to disconnect from people so that they can live in their imaginary world. You know, they will make a conscious decision and say, I don't actually want to interact with the other human beings because of what's going on in my head is more fun and I have more control over it and it's exciting to see where it's going. They just like it more. And so that can be another thing that pulls them apart from people. They have a definite preferred environment. They want to be alone where they can think and they can meditate and they can imagine, and they don't really want to interact with other people. They're not social learners at all. One of the things that we can do to really encourage this, to help them develop their own personality and their own learning, is just to acknowledge that life is exciting. There's a lot of wonder. There's a lot of things to discover. There's a lot of things to imagine, and that's good, and that we love to see that in what they're bringing to the table. They love art. They love discussion, which is, you know, that is actually interacting with other people. So that is a great way to work that in and make sure that there's some social happening, that you can also be discussing ideas and say, you know, I read this book and you read that book, and can we talk about the ideas that we brought? And it's really fascinating because now you're giving them fodder to take to their next imaginative session and be able to work that in, that I hadn't considered that idea before. And so that can be a really good way to help them interact with others and also just expand their learning. Some of the tools that we can use to teach this particular personality are literature, because again, there's a story there that they're so visual. They see so much going on in their head. It's like watching a movie while they're reading the story. Poetry, art, drama, all these things are like jumping off points where they can take this and then create something beautiful and glorious inside their heads. If they have issues with math, a lot of times they can draw pictures. And I have a very imaginative child, and when it comes to math, he loves geometry because he can draw all the angles and he can see, and you know, his math book is just all pictures. And they're beautiful pictures. I'm like, wow, I don't ever try that hard on math pictures, but he really tries hard on it. He really creates beautiful artwork, and it helps him understand the math behind the numbers. So that can be a really good way to help them with math. writing a poem to understand history facts. So that's tapping into that artistic, beautiful layer instead of just these dry, dull facts. It can actually create something really pretty in their mind, and it will stick better. Listen to music while reading. And yeah, the same kid who's super artistic, he loves to listen to music while reading. He likes to have that very nice, beautiful environment outside of him, because I know there's a lot of beautiful stuff going on inside his head as well. And they do like to doodle while listening to a speaker. This is something that's really challenging in a lot of personalities. You have to get past, they're not listening because they're not maintaining eye contact, or because they're writing or doodling, or they're doing something else besides looking at me. Understanding the different personalities really opens up a space where you can say, if they're doodling, they're able to listen. If they're sitting there looking at me, they're gone. Their brain is, they're in their own imaginary land. But this kind of gives them a vent so that they can put their imagination there and still listen to what you're saying. They really like to compose things, music, works of art, a lot of things. They just love to compose things. They like to construct them, design. They like to create. They like to take something that isn't and bring order to it and turn it into something that is. Invent, originate, create, all these things. They like to write imaginatively. They like to combine ideas. So they don't necessarily always come up with new ideas, but they'll take two ideas that hadn't been put together before and they'll create something new with them. And that is another way to create, that it's not always coming from scratch. Sometimes it's just taking something, going on Pinterest and saying that's a lovely idea, but I think if we just twist it a little bit like this, it will work better for our family. That is a very creative way to take some things that are already out there and make them yours. Again, it's very important to motivate all kids, and how you motivate these kids is you want to acknowledge what they're doing. Acknowledge that when they're quiet and in their head, that there is something actually happening. Acknowledge that they're being creative and that they are imaginative, and that is a very good and powerful thing, because silence sometimes can be easy to ignore, especially if you have a lot of kids. It's easy to think, well, at least that one's not bleeding or screaming or whatever, but you want to recognize that something is happening here, and it's a lot of work, and it's actually really valuable. Let them work on super creative projects. So not something that has a lot of boundaries to it, but something you can say, well, if you were a fairy, what would you do with these flowers? And just wide open, let them decide, let them create on a basis that doesn't have any expected results. It's just something that allows them to show their own creativity. They do like to work alone most of the time, so just allow plenty of time for that. And then they like to show off their creation. So it is important to create space where you can say, hey, I acknowledge that you made something and it is of value, and let's spend time looking at it and being really impressed with what you created. So in summary, it's really important to have a beautiful environment in all sorts of ways to help these guys have a great imagination. One of the ways is background music. You also want to have time for quiet, imaginative play. And I have had several children who have been very, very imaginative when they were young. And now a couple have they've grown up and they're into art and acting and writing, and all these things have kind of sprung from that time where they were allowed to just play and imagine for really literally hours on end every single day. Give them some Legos, give them some toys that they can play with, and let them go, and they are creating worlds in their heads. And one now actually does world building as he writes fantasy novels. He actually creates world on paper, and that's so easy for him because he was so creative as a kid. He was so imaginative. So it blooms into some beautiful things. They can draw, or they can write poetry, and they love this. Some kids are going to hate this, and it's a horrible thing that they have to do. Please, not a poem. Don't make me rhyme. I'm going to die. But these guys, this personality is going to absolutely love that. This is the perfect way for them to express themselves. Let them do it. That's a great way. Now they know poetry, and they're able to show what they've learned. So perfect. Do that. In really allowing them to make a little bit of noise. I find that most of my creative kids, my imaginative kids, are talking to themselves. They're quiet about it, but they are quite often having conversations with themselves or sometimes with other people, and they're imagining a lot of stuff, and you have to create space where you're like, that's okay. I'm not going to come in and be like, what are you doing? That's so weird. So you have to allow that and just recognize they're going to be talking to themselves for the rest of their lives probably, but it is just fine that this is a place where you can create and imagine and learn in the ways that's natural to you. This personality is so much fun because they bring so much creativity and imagination to everything that they do, and they also create some really beautiful things in that process. So having a child in your home that has this personality can be such a joy and so much fun to see what they can create out of nothing except their own experience and their own imagination. that is it. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will catch you on the next one.